Could Ezekiel 38 be closer than we think? Jack Hibbs. Have you noticed something? Every time the Middle East makes the news, every time Israel is surrounded, every time Iran is mentioned, people rush to the same place in the Bible, Ezekiel chapter 38. Some say this is it. Others say it's all speculation, and many quietly wonder, what am I supposed to do with all of this? But what if we've been asking the wrong question? What if Ezekiel 38 was never meant to turn us into headline chasers? Never meant to make us nervous? Never meant to send us hunting for dates and timelines? What if it was meant to wake us up, not to fear, but to discern? You see, the Bible doesn't shout prophecy. It whispers it. It hides it in patterns, in repetitions, in small phrases most people overlook. And in Ezekiel 38, there is one phrase like that. So small, it almost sounds harmless. So familiar, we assume we already understand it. It says Israel will be living securely in a land of unwalled villages. Most people read that and move on. But that single line may be the most dangerous condition mentioned in the entire prophecy. Because throughout Scripture, there's a pattern. God repeats again and again. The greatest danger doesn't come when a nation feels threatened. It comes when it feels confident, when it feels untouchable, when it believes it has finally reached safety. And that's where this ancient prophecy begins to feel uncomfortably relevant. Not because of missiles, not because of alliances, but because of the human heart. So today, I'm not here to tell you this is the war of Ezekiel 38, and I'm not here to stir fear or speculation. Instead, I want to slow down, step back from the noise, and ask a deeper question. What kind of world produces the conditions Ezekiel described? And more importantly, what kind of people are we meant to be when those conditions appear? Let's begin not with fear, but with understanding. There are moments when it feels like the whole world is staring at the same screen, the same maps, the same breaking alerts, the same images that keep repeating day after day. And right now, it feels like we're living inside one of those moments. The Middle East is back in the headlines. Israel, Iran, America, alliances forming, threats being exchanged. And everywhere you turn, people are asking, what does this mean? Some are watching with fear, some with fascination, some with a quiet sense that something bigger is unfolding, even if they can't quite put it into words. It's as if the world senses a shift, but doesn't know how to interpret it. And when moments like this happen, there's a pattern we've seen before. People begin searching for meaning, not just political meaning, but prophetic meaning. They start opening their Bibles, or at least dusting off the parts they've heard about. And almost immediately, one chapter rises to the surface again and again. Ezekiel chapter 38. It's quoted in conversations, debated online, referenced in videos, and attached to nearly every new development coming out of the region. For some, it feels like confirmation. For others, it feels like confusion. And for many believers, it creates an uneasy tension between watching the news and trusting the Word. But here's the question we rarely stop to ask. Are we actually understanding what we're watching, or are we simply reacting to it? Because there's a difference between seeing events and discerning times. There's a difference between being informed and being awakened. The Bible never calls God's people to panic when the world shakes. It calls them to perceive, to understand, to see beneath the surface of events and recognize the patterns that have been unfolding for generations. You see, the most dangerous moments in history are not when everything collapses overnight. They're the moments when things appear stable on the outside, while something unseen is shifting underneath. And Scripture tells us this again and again. Long before nations fall, before alliances clash, before history turns a corner, there is always a season of watching. A season when people are looking but not truly seeing, hearing but not fully understanding what they're hearing. That's why moments like this matter. Not because they give us permission to speculate, but because they invite us to slow down, to step back from the urgency of the headlines and ask a deeper question. Not, is this the prophecy? But what is God showing us about the times we're living in? Because Ezekiel 38 was never meant to be a puzzle for the curious. It was meant to be a signpost for the discerning. A warning, yes, but also an invitation. An invitation to move from fear to clarity, from noise to understanding, and from simply watching events unfold to recognizing the patterns behind them. And that's where we need to go next. Ezekiel 38 might be one of the most quoted chapters in all of biblical prophecy. People know the names: Gog, Magog, the nations from the north, the massive invasion, the end-time war. Those words get highlighted, underlined, debated, and shared every time the world shakes. But here's the strange thing. While everyone is quoting the prophecy, almost everyone is missing the detail that actually holds it together. Because God has a way of hiding the key in plain sight. If you read Ezekiel 38 carefully, you'll notice that before the armies move, before the alliances form, before a single weapon is raised, God pauses to describe something else. He describes the condition of the land, the state of the people, the atmosphere of the nation that will one day be invaded. And the description is surprisingly simple, almost quiet, almost easy to overlook. Israel, we're told, will be living securely, dwelling in unwalled villages, a people without bars or gates. Most readers pass right over that line. It doesn't sound dramatic. It doesn't feel urgent. It doesn't fit our modern images of tanks and missiles and intelligence agencies. So we assume we already know what it means. We assume it must be symbolic, or outdated, or irrelevant to the modern world. And yet, that single description may be the most important part of the entire prophecy. Because prophecy doesn't begin with war. It begins with condition. God doesn't start by telling us what Gog will do. He starts by showing us what Israel will be like when Gog decides to move. And that's not accidental. In Scripture, God always reveals the heart of a moment before he reveals the events of a moment. He shows us the atmosphere before the outcome, the posture before the collision. And here's where things get uncomfortable. Living securely doesn't mean living peacefully. It doesn't mean there are no enemies. It doesn't mean there are no threats. It means something far more subtle. It means confidence. It means a sense of safety. It means the belief that whatever dangers exist, they are manageable, contained, under control. Throughout the Bible, that condition appears again and again right before disaster. When nations feel strongest, when defenses seem sufficient, when victories pile up, when people stop watching because they believe they no longer need to, that's when the warnings come. Not shouted, whispered. And the phrase unwalled villages isn't about the absence of protection. It's about the absence of perceived vulnerability. In the ancient world, walls were a sign of fear. Gates were a sign of caution. Bars were a confession that danger was near. To live without them wasn't bravery. It was confidence. Sometimes misplaced confidence. That's why this detail matters so much. Because Ezekiel isn't just describing architecture, he's describing mindset. He's not talking about bricks and stone. He's talking about a people who believe they are secure enough to let their guard down. And that's where this prophecy begins to shift from the ancient world into our own. Because once you understand that, you realize Ezekiel 38 isn't just about who attacks Israel. It's about when they believe they no longer need to worry about being attacked. And that leads us to the next question. If Israel isn't rushing toward war, then who is driving this invasion in the first place? And that's where the story takes a much deeper turn. One of the most overlooked truths in Ezekiel 38 is also one of the most unsettling. Because when people talk about this prophecy, they usually focus on what Gog does, the armies he gathers, the nations that follow him, the direction of the invasion. But God tells us something shocking before any of that happens. He tells us who is really in control. And it isn't Gog, it isn't the generals, it isn't the alliances, it's him. God speaks directly to Gog and says, I will turn you around. I will put hooks into your jaws, and I will bring you out. That's not poetic language. That's not symbolic fluff. That's authority. It means Gog isn't acting because he suddenly has a brilliant idea. He's not moving because Israel provoked him. He's not responding to some political necessity. He's being pulled, redirected, compelled into motion by a force greater than his own will. In other words, Ezekiel 38 does not begin with human ambition. It begins with divine intervention. That's a hard concept for the modern mind to accept, because we're trained to believe history is shaped by elections, economics, and military strategy. But Scripture tells a very different story. It tells us that behind the visible movements of nations, there is an invisible hand guiding events toward an appointed moment. Kings think they are choosing, empires think they are expanding, Leaders think they are acting freely, and all the while, God is steering history toward his purposes. We've seen this pattern before. Pharaoh didn't wake up one morning planning to glorify the God of Israel. Yet God hardened his heart and turned his stubbornness into a stage for deliverance. Assyria didn't see itself as a tool in God's hand. Babylon didn't imagine it was fulfilling prophecy. But again and again, Scripture shows us the same truth. God uses nations that don't even know they're being used. He turns pride into prophecy, power into purpose, resistance into fulfillment. And that's what makes this moment in Ezekiel so important. God doesn't say Gog will eagerly rush toward Israel. The implication is the opposite. Gog is facing away, focused elsewhere. But something changes, something shifts, and God says, I will turn you back. The timing isn't Gog's idea, it's God's timing. The direction isn't Gog's plan, it's God's design. That means Ezekiel 38 isn't about a world spiraling out of control. It's about a world moving exactly according to a script written long before the players ever took the stage. And that should change how we read the headlines. Because if God is the one pulling nations by the jaw, then fear is no longer the right response. Discernment is, humility is, watchfulness is. And it also means something else that's deeply personal. If God governs the movements of empires, then he also governs the seasons of our lives. If he can redirect the will of nations, he can redirect circumstances we don't understand. History is not chaotic, it's purposeful. And Ezekiel 38 reminds us that even when the world appears unstable, the throne of God remains unmoved. But that leads us to another question. If God is the one drawing Gog forward, what kind of alliance does he draw him into? And why do these particular nations gather at this particular moment in history? That's where the picture becomes even clearer. When Ezekiel begins to name the nations that move with Gog, he isn't just listing geography. He's revealing a pattern, a convergence, a gathering of histories that have been moving toward each other for a very long time. To the casual reader, the list sounds ancient and distant, names from another world. But to those who look closer, the picture becomes strikingly familiar. From the far north comes the leader, powerful, strategic, detached at first, and then come the partners, Persia, Cush, Put, Gomer, Togarmah. Nations from different regions, different cultures, different motivations. And yet they all arrive at the same place, at the same time, with the same target, Israel. And that's not random, because alliances don't form in a vacuum. They form around shared interests, shared grievances, and sometimes shared hatreds. What Ezekiel shows us is that this is not simply a military coalition. It's the resurfacing of an ancient hostility, one that predates modern borders and modern politics. A hostility that runs deeper than oil, territory, or influence. It's a resistance to the very existence of Israel in the land God gave her. And that resistance didn't begin in the 20th century. It didn't begin with the United Nations. It didn't begin with modern conflicts. It goes all the way back to the earliest pages of Scripture. From the moment God chose Abraham, opposition followed. From the moment Israel emerged as a people, resistance arose. Empires came and went, languages changed, borders shifted, but the pressure against Israel never fully disappeared. It only changed forms. And Ezekiel 38 shows us what happens when those old currents begin to flow together again. When ancient resentments find modern expression. When history, theology, and geopolitics intersect in a way that feels almost inevitable. What's especially revealing is the role of Persia. In the Bible, Persia once served as an instrument of restoration. God used a Persian king to send Israel home from exile. But in Ezekiel's vision, Persia stands on the opposite side, no longer restoring, but advancing, no longer protecting, but provoking. It's a reminder that nations can change roles over time, but the spiritual struggle beneath history remains the same. And yet, this alliance is not united by friendship. It's united by opportunity, by the perception that Israel is vulnerable, that the moment is right, that resistance will be minimal. They are drawn together not because they trust each other, but because they believe the outcome will be worth the risk. And that belief, that calculation, is exactly what sets the stage for what comes next. Because Scripture tells us something sobering. When ancient hatreds resurface, they often do so under the illusion of advantage. When opposition feels strongest, it usually believes victory is certain. And that's why Ezekiel doesn't portray this alliance as cautious. He portrays it as confident, convinced, ready to move. And that confidence is tied directly to how Israel is perceived at that moment in history. So the question becomes, what kind of Israel draws this alliance forward? What conditions convince these nations that the time is right? And why does God allow that perception to form in the first place? To answer that, we have to look at something even more extraordinary. The miracle that makes this prophecy possible at all. There is something we often forget when we talk about Ezekiel 38. Before there can be an invasion, before there can be alliances, before there can be armies moving toward Israel, something far more unlikely has to happen first. Israel has to exist, not as a memory, not as a religious idea, but as a nation, back on its ancient land. And for nearly 2,000 years, that alone seemed impossible. Think about that. No other people in history were scattered across the world for centuries, stripped of their land, their sovereignty, their capital, and yet returned. Not only returned, but returned speaking the same ancient language, bearing the same name, rebuilding the same cities, restoring the same homeland described in Scripture. Empires tried, kings tried, the world tried. But no one could erase Israel, and no one could explain how it came back. Ezekiel saw this long before it happened. He spoke of a people regathered from many nations, drawn back from the sword, brought home from lands far away, returning to mountains that had been desolate for generations. When he said those words, Israel was broken, exiled, scattered. There was no political movement, no global sympathy, no modern Zionism. There was no reason, humanly speaking, to believe it would ever happen. And yet, it did. In 1948, something ancient and prophetic quietly stepped back onto the stage of history. Israel was reborn in a single day. And with that moment, dozens of prophecies moved from impossible to inevitable. Ezekiel 38 didn't suddenly become relevant because of modern weapons or modern wars. It became possible because the people Ezekiel described were finally home. That's why this matters so much. Ezekiel 38 is not a random end-time scenario. It's built on a foundation, a prerequisite, a miracle that had to occur first. Without the regathering, there is no prophecy. Without the return, there is no invasion. Without Israel restored, there is no stage on which the final act can unfold. And here's the part that often gets overlooked. Ezekiel doesn't just say the people return. He says they settle, they dwell, they live, they build lives on the land. This isn't a temporary presence. It's a rooted one. A people no longer wandering, no longer surviving on borrowed ground, but reestablished in their own inheritance. That detail matters because it tells us something about timing. God doesn't rush prophecy. He prepares it, slowly, carefully, over generations. And that leads to something sobering. Because once a people are restored, once they are rooted, once the miracle becomes normal, another condition begins to form. Familiarity, confidence, a sense that what was once impossible is now secure. And that's where the next layer of Ezekiel's vision begins to surface. Because the same God who brings a nation home also warns that the moment of restoration can quietly become the moment of overconfidence. And that brings us to the condition Ezekiel highlights next, a people living securely. And why that security may be far more dangerous than it sounds. There's a phrase in Ezekiel 38 that sounds comforting at first, almost reassuring. It says, the people of Israel will be living securely. And when we hear that in modern English, we instinctively think it means peace, safety, calm, no threats, no enemies. But that's not what the word means in the language Ezekiel was using. And that misunderstanding may be one of the most dangerous mistakes we can make when reading this prophecy. Living securely doesn't mean the absence of danger. It means the assumption that danger has been handled. It's not peace, it's confidence. It's the belief that whatever threats exist are manageable, contained, under control. In other words, it's not a condition of rest. It's a condition of assurance. And throughout the Bible, that condition appears again and again at the most vulnerable moments in a nation's history. Scripture shows us a pattern. When God's people are weak, they tend to pray. When they're dependent, they tend to listen. But when they feel secure, something subtle happens. Watchfulness fades. Urgency softens. Gratitude turns into assumption. The miracle becomes normal. And the normal becomes taken for granted. That's when warnings are usually ignored, not because people are rebellious, but because they're comfortable. We see this pattern in Israel's past. After great victories, after seasons of deliverance, after times when enemies were pushed back and borders felt stable, the people often relaxed. They didn't stop believing in God. They simply stopped leaning on Him with the same intensity. Confidence replaced dependence. And history tells us what followed. The surprise attacks. The invasions that came when Israel least expected them. Not when they were weakest, but when they believed they were strong enough. That's why the Bible treats security with caution, because security without humility becomes blindness. Confidence without vigilance becomes vulnerability. And Ezekiel's description doesn't paint a picture of a frightened nation. It paints a picture of a self-assured one, a people who believe their defenses are sufficient, their intelligence reliable, their strength proven, a nation that feels it has already survived the worst. And here's the sobering part. That mindset doesn't just affect how a nation sees itself. It affects how others see it too. When confidence replaces caution, it can look like openness. When assurance replaces alertness, it can look like accessibility. To an outside observer, especially an enemy watching from afar, that confidence can appear as an opportunity. That's why Ezekiel pairs living securely with unwalled villages, not because Israel is defenseless, but because it believes it doesn't need the kind of defenses it once relied on. The danger isn't weakness. The danger is trust placed in the wrong place. And that's where the prophecy tightens. Because when a nation feels secure, others begin to believe it can be taken by surprise. And that brings us to the next image Ezekiel gives us. A land without walls. Not a land without strength, but a land whose security has shifted from visible barriers to invisible confidence. And that shift changes everything. When Ezekiel describes Israel as a land without walls, bars, or gates, it's easy to misunderstand what he's saying. Many assume it means Israel will be weak, exposed, unprepared. But that's not the picture Ezekiel's painting. He's not describing a nation without strength. He's describing a nation whose strength no longer looks the way it once did. In the ancient world, walls were everything. They were the first line of defense, the symbol of caution, the visible confession that danger was real. Gates and bars meant watchfulness. They meant readiness. To live without them wasn't reckless, but it was confident. It meant that people believed their situation had changed, that the old threats had been neutralized, that the need for constant vigilance had passed. Ezekiel isn't saying Israel will lack protection. He's saying Israel will no longer depend on protection. That looks obvious. The walls are gone not because the nation is careless, but because it believes it has evolved beyond them. Its security is no longer built on stone and mortar, but on something less visible: intelligence, technology, speed, strength, deterrence. The kinds of defenses that don't need walls because they believe they can strike before danger arrives. And that's where the deception enters. Not deception in the sense of foolishness, but deception in the sense of perception. To Israel, this confidence feels justified. It feels earned. After all, it has survived wars. It has defeated enemies. It has adapted again and again in a hostile region. From the inside, it feels strong, resilient, alert. But from the outside, it can look different. To an enemy watching from a distance, a land without walls looks open. A people without visible barriers looks accessible. Confidence can resemble complacency. Strength can resemble overexposure. And that misreading becomes part of the trap, because Ezekiel tells us the invader believes Israel is ripe for the taking. He believes the defenses are insufficient. He believes the time is right. That belief is what draws the invasion forward. Not because Israel is actually defenseless, but because its security appears incomplete to those who don't understand its true strength. And behind that misunderstanding stands something even deeper. God allows the perception to form. He allows the illusion of vulnerability to exist, not to abandon his people, but to set the stage for his own intervention. Throughout Scripture, God often allows his people to appear exposed right before he moves most powerfully. He lets the enemy misjudge the situation. He permits overconfidence on one side and miscalculation on the other. Because when victory comes, it leaves no doubt where it came from. Not from walls, not from weapons, but from the hand of God. And that raises a critical question. If Israel is not actually weak, but merely perceived as vulnerable, then what convinces the nations that this is the moment to strike? What shifts their confidence from caution to action? To understand that, we have to look at timing. Because Ezekiel doesn't just tell us what will happen, he tells us when the conditions are finally right. At this point, a question naturally rises in almost every mind. Are we there yet? Are these the moments Ezekiel was seeing? Is what we're watching on the news the very fulfillment of this prophecy? And it's an understandable question. When events feel intense, when the players seem to line up, when the pressure builds, it's human to assume the climax has arrived. But Scripture calls us to something more careful than assumption. It calls us to discernment. The Bible makes a distinction between something forming and something fulfilling. Many prophetic events move through seasons. Conditions develop. Alignments take shape. Patterns repeat and intensify. But that doesn't mean the final moment has arrived. It means the stage is being prepared. And God, in his wisdom, often allows long periods of preparation before sudden fulfillment. Ezekiel gives us timing clues, not dates. He speaks of events happening after many days and in the latter years. Those phrases don't rush us, they slow us down. They remind us that prophecy unfolds on God's schedule, not ours. And that's why it's dangerous to declare fulfillment too early. Doing so doesn't strengthen faith. It weakens it when events shift or delay. If we take Ezekiel seriously, we also have to take his conditions seriously. Israel isn't described as desperate. It's not portrayed as overwhelmed or collapsing. It's described as settled, confident, secure. That suggests a moment after victories, not during crises. A season when threats feel manageable, not existential. A time when survival feels assured, not uncertain. That's why many who study this passage carefully believe something else still precedes the invasion. A season in which Israel overcomes immediate dangers, a period in which enemies are pushed back, deterrence is strengthened, and confidence grows. Not arrogance, but assurance. The sense that the worst has been handled. That's the environment Ezekiel describes. Not one of chaos, but one of control. This doesn't mean nothing significant is happening now. It means what's happening now may be part of the forming, not the fulfilling. The tremors, not the quake. The alignment, not the collision. And that perspective protects us from fear on one side and from sensationalism on the other. It allows us to watch without panic and to wait without indifference. Because timing in prophecy isn't just about events. It's about readiness. God doesn't reveal the end so we can predict the calendar. He reveals it so we can prepare the heart. And that leads us to the most important question of all. Not whether Ezekiel 38 is happening right now, but what kind of people we are becoming as the conditions take shape. And that's where the prophecy turns from the nations to us. By the time we reach this point in Ezekiel's vision, something becomes clear. This prophecy was never meant to be studied at a distance. It isn't just a map of future events. It's a mirror. And the longer you look into it, the more you realize Ezekiel isn't only describing what nations will do. He's asking what kind of people God's own people will be when those things begin to unfold. Because Scripture doesn't reveal the end of history to satisfy curiosity. It reveals it to shape character. Again and again, the Bible shows us that the real danger in the last days isn't chaos outside of us, but complacency within us. Not persecution, but distraction. Not fear, but false security. And that's why Ezekiel's prophecy lingers so carefully on condition before conflict, on mindset before movement, on watchfulness before war. Jesus echoed the same warning centuries later. He didn't say the last days would be defined by ignorance. He said they would be defined by normalcy. People eating and drinking, building and planting, living life as usual. Not sinful things, just ordinary things. And the danger wasn't that people were doing wrong, but that they were doing life without awareness, without urgency, without discernment. That's why Ezekiel 38 presses a deeper question upon us. Not, can you identify the nations, but can you recognize the moment? Not, do you know the prophecy, but are you living awake? Because it's possible to believe the Bible, study prophecy, and still drift into spiritual sleep. It's possible to know the signs of the times and still miss what God is asking of you personally. Watchfulness in Scripture is never about anxiety. It's about alignment. It's about living in a way that's anchored, sober-minded, and rooted in truth. Not pulled back and forth by every headline, not driven by speculation or fear, but grounded in the confidence that God is in control and that our lives have purpose in this moment. So the question Ezekiel leaves us with is not whether Gog is moving, it's whether we are. Are we moving closer to God or slowly coasting on yesterday's faith? Are we listening more to the noise of the world or to the voice of the Spirit? Are we living as people who know history is headed somewhere, or as people who assume tomorrow will always look like today? Because the end of the age doesn't just test nations, it tests hearts. It reveals where our trust truly lies. And that brings us to the final reason God reveals prophecy at all. Not to frighten his people, but to prepare them. Not to overwhelm them, but to call them higher. And that's where Ezekiel's message ultimately leads. From the shaking of nations to the calling of God's people. If there's one truth Ezekiel leaves us with, it's this. God does not reveal the end of the story to scare his people. He reveals it to steady them. He doesn't pull back the curtain on the future to create panic, but to invite preparation, to call his people out of distraction and into alignment, out of noise and into holiness. Because prophecy was never meant to replace faith. It was meant to deepen it. When God shows us what is coming, he isn't asking us to obsess over headlines. He's asking us to lift our eyes above them, to stop living reactively and start living intentionally. The shaking of nations is not meant to shake our confidence. It's meant to expose where our confidence truly rests. And that's why Ezekiel 38 doesn't end with fear. It ends with revelation. God says he will act so that the nations may know that he is the Lord. Not so they will admire Israel's strength. Not so they will marvel at military power. But so they will see his hand unmistakably at work. And that truth brings everything back into focus. Because when the world is loud, God's call is often quiet. When events feel overwhelming, his invitation is simple. Return to me, stay awake, live holy, walk humbly. Don't let comfort lull you into sleep. Don't let fear drive you into hiding. Live as people who know that history is not random and the future is not uncertain. The greatest danger in the last days is not persecution, it's distraction. It's allowing the urgency of the moment to pull us away from the very purpose God has given us in that moment. We were not placed here to speculate endlessly or to retreat in fear. We were placed here to shine, to be salt and light, to live lives that reflect the unshakable kingdom we belong to. So when you watch the news, don't just ask what's happening to the world. Ask what God is forming in you. When the headlines change, don't let your peace change with them. Anchor it in something eternal. Because the same God who foretold the shaking also promised to keep his people. The same God who governs nations also shepherds hearts. Ezekiel 38 reminds us that history is moving toward a moment when God's glory will be undeniable. But until that moment comes, our calling is clear: to move from headlines to holiness, from curiosity to conviction, from watching events unfold to living lives fully surrendered to God. The question is not whether prophecy is unfolding. The question is whether we are ready to stand when it does.